For decades, you were told the same thing. Work hard, save money, invest consistently, and your retirement will be safe. But millions of people are discovering a brutal contradiction. They did everything right. They showed up to work, they paid into retirement plans, they avoided reckless spending. They watched their savings grow. And then, inflation, fees, market crashes, taxes, and rising living costs quietly attacked the one thing they were trying to protect. The strange part? The people who saved the most can sometimes have the most to lose. So how did retirement savings become a system where being responsible doesn't necessarily mean being financially secure? By the end of this story, you'll understand why traditional pensions disappeared, why modern retirement accounts shifted so much risk onto workers, and why simply saving more money isn't always the answer. And there's one detail that makes the entire system more disturbing. Your retirement doesn't depend only on how much money you accumulate. It depends on what happens to the value of that money after you stop working. That is where the pension trap begins. The promise that used to exist. There was a time when retirement worked very differently. For many American workers, especially those employed by large companies or governments, a pension wasn't an investment account you had to manage yourself. You worked, the company contributed, and after enough years, the company promised you a specific monthly payment for the rest of your life. The responsibility was largely on the employer. If markets crashed, the worker wasn't suddenly expected to become a professional investor. But then the system began changing. Companies increasingly moved away from traditional defined benefit pensions towards defined contribution plans, such as the 401k. And that single shift changed the retirement equation. Instead of, we'll pay you a retirement income, the promise became, we will help you build a retirement account. It sounds like a small difference. It isn't. Because now the worker carries much more of the risk. If markets fall before retirement, you feel it. If you live longer than expected, you feel it. If inflation rises, you feel it. And if your savings aren't enough, there is no corporate executive waiting to personally make up the difference. The responsibility has moved from the institution to you. But the next problem is even bigger, because saving money is not the same thing as preserving wealth. The invisible enemy. Consider someone who spends 40 years saving. They finally reach retirement with $500,000. On paper, that sounds like freedom. But money doesn't have a fixed value. If prices rise significantly over decades, the same dollar buys less. That's inflation. And inflation is particularly dangerous for retirees because their income often becomes much less flexible once they stop working. A worker can respond to higher prices by asking for a raise, changing jobs, working overtime, or building another income stream. A retiree can't always do that. Their paycheck has become a portfolio. Their savings have become their salary. And suddenly, every grocery bill, insurance premium, property tax increase, and medical expense matters. This creates a cruel paradox. The saver spends decades accumulating dollars, only to discover that retirement is about how much those dollars can actually buy. And inflation isn't the only threat, because even if your investments grow, you can still lose. The retirement math nobody wants to talk about. Imagine two retirees. Both reach retirement with $1 million. The first retires after years of strong markets. The second retires just before a major market downturn. Same amount of money, completely different outcome. Why? Because of something called sequence of returns risk. During your working years, a market crash can actually be an opportunity. You still have income, you can keep contributing, you have time to recover. But retirement changes the equation. Now you're withdrawing money. Suppose the market falls 25%. You still need $40,000 to live. So you sell investments while they're down. The portfolio isn't simply experiencing a temporary loss anymore. You're turning that loss into a permanent reduction in the capital that must generate your future income. And this is where the pension system reveals another weakness. A traditional pension was designed around paying an income.
A 401k is primarily designed around accumulating assets. Those are not the same problem. One asks, how much income will you receive? The other asks, how much money did you manage to accumulate? And the second question doesn't tell you how long that money will last, which creates the next trap, the number that can lie. Imagine your retirement account reaches $1 million. You feel rich. But now ask a different question. How much can you safely spend every year? That's much harder. You don't know exactly how long you'll live. You don't know future inflation. You don't know future market returns. You don't know future taxes. You don't know future healthcare costs. And you don't know whether the next decade will look anything like the last one. This is why retirement planning isn't really about reaching a magical number. It's about creating sustainable income. And here's the uncomfortable part. The more aggressively you try to grow your retirement account, the more volatility you may expose yourself to. But the more conservatively you invest, the greater the risk that inflation slowly destroys your purchasing power. So retirees are trapped between two forces: risk of losing money and risk of losing purchasing power. Neither one announces itself with a warning siren. One arrives as a market crash. The other arrives as a grocery bill that is slightly higher every year.